hello everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you are. Welcome to the Sojica Conference session 13 on agency. I am Vitor Lopes Andrade, a PhD student at the University of Sussex and chair of the session. Thank you much to Martin for being our facilitator, and he's working like behind the scenes to guarantee that everything goes very well in the session. We will have 3 presentations in this session, but before I need to give you some practical information. So the presentations will be recorded and later posted online, but the Q&A, the questions and answers part, will not be recorded and posted. Because of the number of participants and in the interest of confidentiality, we are unfortunately not able to open the session up to oral questions. However, you can type your questions and comments using the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your screen. And I will select as many questions as there is time for to discuss after the 3 presentations. You can send your questions during the talks. You don't need to wait until the 2 presenters have spoken. And please write to which participant your question is for, or if it's for all of them. As I said before, we have 2 presentations. Each one has 15 minutes. And I will let the speakers know when they have used 10 minutes and then when they have used it all the time. And you can find information about the speakers, like their biographies and abstracts for this session on the conference page of the Sojica website. So just before giving the floor to our speakers, I would like to highlight the importance of this session because as most of you know, when we look at the Soldiers Island studies as a field, as an area of knowledge, most research has a legal perspective. And of course, this is extremely relevant, but there are some limitations as well of the legal perspectives because normally there is this view that the subjects are only people seeking asylum, merely sexual beings. And also, normally nothing is said about the everyday life experiences and how people are gendered, racialized, classed, etc. It's also very common that they're seen just as victims, not as victims and agents at the same time. So this panel is somehow filling this gap in the Soldiers Island studies, and therefore it's quite important. Our speakers are not only academics, but they are also involved with activism, which is quite important for this discussion. And they will talk about 3 different geographical areas. So it's one presentation focusing on France, another one in Italy, and another one focusing on Austria. So having said that, I will give the floor for our first speaker, that is Florent Chaussière, and his presentation is entitled Queer Asylum Seekers in Paris, Negotiation with Non-Belonging in Urban Spaces. Florent, please.
Okay, thanks. Hello, everyone, again. I'm very glad to be here. So my name is Florent. I'm a 3rd-year PhD candidate in University Gustave Eiffel in Paris. And I'd like, first of all, thank all the organizer for this great conference, Vitor for facilitating this session, and thanks a lot to Carmelo, who will help me with my PowerPoint. So next slide, please. I will talk with you about one aspect of my PhD research I am currently conducting in geography about queer asylum seekers and refugees in France, more specifically in Paris area. For this presentation, I will emphasize how queer asylum seekers have to face multiple power relationships in their everyday experiences of urban spaces. This focus will allow me to challenge 2 widespread narratives. The first one, according to which big cities are pictured as heaven for sexual and gender minorities. The second one, portraying the migration of sexual and gender minorities from southern countries to northern countries as a liberation movement. I will present first some elements of my theoretical framework, then I will briefly describe the methods I used, and finally discuss some results. Next slide, please. So first, some element of the theoretical framework. Big cities are often painted as heaven for sexual and gender minorities. This idea is based on two key elements. The first one, urban spaces are supposed to relieve the pressure of cis and heteronormativity by increasing the possibility of anonymity, in contrast to other spaces. Secondly, big cities may provide specific sociability opportunities impossible to find somewhere else, like LGBT bars or LGBT clubs, LGBT organizations, for example. This reality is, of course, partly true, yet it obscures the fact that queer people may face other kinds of inequalities that lead to a situation of differentiated access to those opportunities. Next slide. Many scholars have emphasized the necessity of paying attention to multiple power relationships, such as the one based on gender, class, race, or age, for example, in the understanding of lived experience of sexual or gender minority. Warner explains, for example, sexuality isn't always or only about sexuality. It is not an autonomous dimension of experience. Next slide. When we analyze specific places, Dereka Rochebrook warns us against essentializing approach by emphasizing, despite the complexity of the notion, the term gay space or queer space implies coherence and homogeneity that do not exist. The appearance of homogeneity conceals exclusionary practices predicated on other axes of difference. Next slide. Doing so will allow me to undermine the narrative of migration to northern countries as a liberation for sexual and gender minorities. Queer migration scholars have emphasized that migration experience reshapes inequalities but does not erase them. By taking, among other things, a closer look to the way the administrative status of asylum seeker or refugee impacts how queer people deal with hetero and cis normativity, I will emphasize how refuginess and sexuality and gender intersect. The impact of migration and asylum policies on queer individuals are here analyzed beyond the legal categorization process of asylum determination. Next slide, please. To do so, I rely on a 3 years long ethnographic fieldwork I carried out from February 2017 to January 2020. It was based on participant observation in a Parisian organization supporting queer asylum seekers and refugees. Among all the people I met during these 3 years, I identified a group of approximately 70 people I have developed closer ties with. Next slide, please. Most of them are coming from African countries, as you can see on this map, showing country of origins of key respondents of the study. The map is in French, but I guess you can understand. In addition to this ethnographic fieldwork, I conducted 33 interviews with queer asylum seekers or refugees who were currently or formerly involved in a SOGI asylum claim at the time of the interviews. Next slide. And next slide again. Thanks. So third elements of a result. A big city like Paris offers many specific sociabilities, opportunities for queer people. Yet we have to take a look to unequal access to these opportunities. We can first take the example of LGBT labeled places such as bars or clubs. For asylum seekers who would like to attend such places, there is first of all a cost barrier, as these places are places of consumption. The very precarious situation in which asylum seekers are put, they have a very few amount of financial help given by the state, and they are not allowed to work during the asylum procedure, besides some exceptions, prevent them from attending those places. LGBT bars or clubs are also racialized places. As Nina Head has, for example, pointed out, multiple racializing practices occurring in such places in Manchester mark them as white spaces. In my study of the Parisian case, the question of race-power relationships has been raised by many queer asylum seekers I met, and these took two forms of the same racialized othering process. On one hand, exclusion, on the other hand, exotization. So for example, Kazi, a gay man from Bangladesh, explained me that many times he felt white gay men were not welcoming in gay bars. On the other hand, Steve, a gay man from Cameroon, explains for his part how he experienced as a black man exotization and sexual fetishization in a gay cruising bar. Next slide, please. For example, he said during the interview, "But something I don't like, it's when someone approaches me and says, 'I love black people, you know. I hate this,' because actually it's racist, I think. And a lot of people do not realize. A lot of people tell me, I like black men. So I ask them, why? So then it comes big dick, sluts, all this kind of stuff. They see black men as exotic, and I hate that. So in these kind of places, if you come to me like this, then I ignore you. Because of these multiple potential exclusions, queer asylum seekers sometimes organize and rely on other forms of sociability. NGO organizations assisting them in the asylum procedure may, for example, become a very important place to meet other queer individuals and build a sense of community. However, despite all of this exclusion, some of them still find ways to negotiate their place in LGBT bars or clubs, as these places are perceived as places where they can experience a sense of belonging as queer individuals. Next slide, please. Another challenge queer asylums have to face is that a big city like Paris is marked by the presence of many migrant communities. This can provide help, but can also be problematic for queer asylum seekers. As they may fear to meet other people from the country they left and to be identified as LGBT plus individuals, they develop strategies to adjust their behavior differently according to specific spaces where they are. Such strategies can be framed as spatial agency. For example, Kazi, a gay man from Bangladesh, about the fact of kissing another man in public, explains. Next slide, please. Uncomfortable, but publicly, it doesn't mean anywhere. There is some certain place. Like for example, for Châtelet, it's the name of a Parisian neighborhood, I don't mind if a guy kisses me in Châtelet, but I do mind if a guy wants to kiss me in Gare du Nord or in an Arabic area, or full with Bengali people, because they, even though they are here, their mind is closed, they never accept, and they will talk. Next slide, please. I took some examples to see how queer asylum seekers have to face various marginalization process in urban spaces, yet paying attention to spatial agency of individuals avoid both an essentialized understanding of reality and a victimizing apprehension of individuals. To complete this reflection on multiple power relationship, I will now have a closer look to the experience intersection of sexuality, gender, and refuginess. Next slide, please. So I will here use the term refuginess to express both the objective and subjective effects on migration and asylum policies on individuals. Being identified and classified as asylum seekers or refugees has many consequences, as those specific legal status impact the everyday lives of migrants and not only the moments and places of encounters with state administrations. Refuginess is, for example, experienced in public spaces as a feeling of non-belonging arising from the precarious administrative situation in which asylum seekers find themselves, leading to a significant fear of control or any interaction with the police. Many asylum seekers explain me, for example, that they were avoiding certain places in the city to avoid contact with police, as they fear to have problems, even though there is no problem with their situation as asylum seekers. They are legally here during all the asylum procedure. The feeling of illegitimacy in the country of arrival impacts the way people perceive and navigate public spaces. Yet, an intersectional approach of refuginess and sexuality have to emphasize that power relations are not just additive, but mutually constituted. It appears through multiple examples I've seen that this feeling of illegitimacy directly affects how queer migrants experience the fact of being sexual or gender minorities. Next slide, please. I will give here two examples. So the first one is Jean, who explains, when I speak about the police, often when I was an asylum seeker, once I was assaulted in the metro, someone called me a faggot, insulted me, and so on. I took my courage to go to the police. I filed a complaint against this person. But I know that there are a lot of asylum seekers who have not the strength to go to the police. They are thinking, no, like, I'm a foreigner, I'm an asylum seeker. The second example is Leila, lesbian woman from Tunisia, explaining the changes in her life when she was granted refugee status. Tunisian people know each other in France. Sometimes when I go to Belleville, well, I run into people that I met in a city of Tunisia at university or high school. But I'm afraid of them, of their look actually. But now I'm not afraid anymore. What has changed? The fact that you see on your paper international protection, well, you're reassured. It's just a piece of paper, that's all, but it's reassuring. It's like your life changes in a split second. It's true I'm still quiet, but I feel I'm protected. For example, now I can go to the Marais, I can go to parties, and I'm not afraid to meet someone I know in the street. Next slide, please. Many works of geographers remind us that norms regulating public spaces play a major role into the affirmation of heteronormativity. These examples show how heteronormativity is experienced intersectionally. Here, refugees lead to increase the exposure to this norm as queer asylum seekers' administrative situation raise their feeling of non-belonging and insecurity. As Leila's example illustrates, the fear of other Tunisian people in France is actually linked to her precarious situation as an asylum seeker. We can find a similar example with trans people, as all the appointments they have with state services during the asylum procedure multiplies the moments where they can be misgendered because of the inadequacy between their gender identity and the papers produced by administration to identify them. So I had the example of a trans woman. I will not have the time to explain in details here, who told me such incident in a prefecture where an agent called her Mr. in the waiting room. And refuginess here is characterized by a multiplication of paper, documents, forms produced in order to identify and control asylum seekers, which can lead to many experiences of misgendering for trans people. Next slide, please. For these two examples, I wanted to show how refuginess intersect with gender and sexuality. By doing so, I argue that migration and asylum policies play a major role in the ways hetero and cis normativities are experienced by queer migrants in their everyday lives. Next slide, please. And for a quick conclusion, I'd like to emphasize only 2 points. First, the importance of having an intersectional look to address everyday experiences of queer asylum seekers or refugees in countries of arrival, and the way it affects their relation to urban spaces. Secondly, the necessity of taking into consideration the ways migration and asylum policies impact queer asylum seekers and refugee lives, not only through the asylum determination process. A closer look given to the way refuginess intersects with queerness shows the impacts of administrative and legal status on the way queer individuals can face or not heteronormativity and cisnormativity. This strongly undermines the migration as liberation narrative, as it reminds that the liminal and precarious state asylum seekers are put in contribute to expose them even more as sexual or gender minorities in countries of arrival. Next slide, please. Here is just some references I used for my work. And thanks all of you for your attention, and especially Carmelo for the PowerPoint. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this also very fascinating presentation. That was some points were related with what Danny said before, like these power relationships and this narrative of liberation and also in terms of methodology, because you have also conducted an ethnographic field work. And I really, I thought it was really interesting, your points on exoticization, like about race in the LGBTI places, and also this dual role of the migrant communities as at the same time being supportive, but also putting the asylum claimants and the refugees in a situation of risk, like in the host countries. And of course, the intersectional approach, I found it very interesting.